Sure. Here's a series of 3 terrifyingly real HFY, humanity. Yeah. Train horror stories that blend the eerie and the unknown with the raw strength of humanity's will to survive. 1. The Midnight Express. It was a stormy night, the kind where the wind howled like a wounded animal, and the rain lashed against the windows with a fury that made you feel like the world was coming to an end. A lone passenger, Sam, boarded the last train heading through the desolate wilderness. He had missed the earlier departures, and now, with no other options, he was stuck. The train began its journey, clattering over the tracks in a rhythmic, soothing way, but something about it felt wrong. The lights flickered in the cabin, and the air grew thick, stale, like something had been buried in it for too long. Sam rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the feeling of unease crawling up his spine. Halfway through the journey, the train came to a screeching halt. Sam's heart raced as a loud thud echoed from the engine room, followed by a guttural growl. Panic set in as the power went out, leaving the passengers in total darkness. Sam's eyes adjusted, and through the small windows, he saw movement in the woods, shadows twisted in unnatural shapes. Just outside the reach of the light, the growls turned into screams, human screams, distorted and garbled, like they had come from the depths of the earth itself. He tried to scream for help, but the only sound that came out was a whisper, "We're not alone." The train doors suddenly opened. A thick, sulphurous fog rolled in, and the passengers in the car started moving toward it. One by one, Sam fought back, realizing they weren't walking on their own volition, they were being compelled, dragged by something beyond their understanding. His instincts kicked in. He bolted for the exit, pushing past people who were frozen in place, their eyes wide, fixed in a haunting stare. Sam didn't look back until he reached the control room, where he found the conductor dead, his eyes wide in terror. The growls were louder now, closer. Sam looked out through the cabin window to see dark, twisted creatures emerging from the fog. Without a second thought, Sam jumped from the train, running into the forest with every ounce of strength he could muster. The creatures were fast, but human determination was faster. He didn't stop running, and when he finally found a highway hours later, he collapsed, barely able to breathe. The authorities found the train the next morning. It had been abandoned. Not a single trace of its passengers, but Sam knew the truth. Some things didn't belong to this world, and humanity had survived another encounter with them. 2. The trolley in the depths. In a sleepy mining town nestled in the mountains, the old trolley system was the lifeblood of the community. The narrow trains carried workers deep into the mines, toiling away in the earth to harvest precious minerals. But after an incident many years ago, the trolley was shut down, the workers never returned, and the town was left in eerie silence. Years later, a group of explorers decided to investigate the abandoned mines. They had heard rumors, whispers of something darker, something alive, lurking in the tunnels, but curiosity and the allure of uncovering forgotten history were too tempting. They boarded the old trolley at dusk, making their way down the forgotten tracks. The trolley jerked to life with an unsettling screech, as though it hadn't been used in decades. The air inside was thick with dust, and the lights flickered as they descended deeper into the mountain. They could hear the sound of the wheels grinding against the tracks, a sound that grew louder, more oppressive, until it became deafening. Suddenly, the trolley came to an abrupt halt, and the air went cold, unnaturally cold. The explorers turned to see the driver's seat empty. Yet the controls were moving as if someone invisible was steering it. Without warning, the doors burst open. Figures, humanoid yet not quite human, emerged from the shadows, their bodies contorted in grotesque ways, eyes glowing with an otherworldly fire. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The explorers were paralyzed, rooted to the spot as the creatures moved closer, surrounding the trolley. And then, as if the night itself had become alive, the walls of the tunnel began to pulse, the ground beneath them trembled, and the sound of ancient, horrific laughter echoed from the deep, reverberating through the hollow space. One explorer, desperate to survive, took the controls of the trolley and forced it to move. The creatures shrieked in fury, but they couldn't stop it. The trolley sped up, faster than it had ever gone before, hurtling down the tracks, past tunnels they'd never seen, until finally, it stopped. They weren't in the mines anymore. The explorers found themselves in a vast underground city, ancient and abandoned, with twisted, deformed statues lining the streets. They were no longer alone. Something else was waiting in the shadows, watching, waiting for them to make their next move. 3. The train that never stops. This story begins in a small city, where a new train service was launched to ease congestion and bring prosperity to the area. The train was state-of-the-art, designed for comfort and speed, but there was something odd about it. No one had ever seen the same conductor twice. The passengers, mostly commuters, had reported that the ride was too smooth. It didn't feel like a normal train. It was almost too perfect. One day, a local journalist named Lisa decided to take a ride to investigate the mysterious train. She boarded, took her seat, and settled in for the ride. The train departed at precisely 7 a.m., and for the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. But then, the train didn't stop. At every station, the train sailed past without slowing, ignoring the stops and schedules. Lisa pressed the emergency button, but it did nothing. The train kept going, its speed steadily increasing. The other passengers didn't seem to care, some even falling asleep. Hours passed. The train never slowed. As the landscape outside grew increasingly unfamiliar, Lisa approached the conductor's booth. Inside, she found the conductor standing still, his eyes glowing unnaturally bright, locked on the front of the train. He turned to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We can never stop," he said, his voice cold and mechanical. "You were chosen." Lisa, terrified, backed away, but it was too late. The train didn't just travel across the city. It was moving between realities, between dimensions. The passengers were not just commuters, they were lost souls, doomed to ride the train forever, unable to escape its grasp. Lisa, now part of the endless procession of passengers, realized that the train was not just a form of transportation. It was a prison, and humanity's will was the only thing that might eventually break its hold. But no one had ever escaped the train, not yet. These stories explore humanity's resilience in the face of the unknown, where the horrors of the supernatural are met with the will to survive and the determination to push forward, even in the darkest of circumstances. 4. The Whispering Tracks. Derek had always enjoyed train rides. They were his escape from the hustle and bustle of his everyday life. On a crisp autumn evening, he boarded the 9:45 p.m. train, heading to visit his family in a small town 2 hours away. The night was still, and the train carriage was mostly empty, with only a few other passengers scattered about. As the train rattled along the tracks, Derek noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible whispering filled the air. It was so soft at first that he dismissed it as the usual creaks and sounds of the train. But as the minutes ticked by, the whispers grew louder, becoming clearer though still unintelligible. Looking around, Derek saw the other passengers were unusually calm, as if the whispers were a normal part of the ride. But the closer he listened, the more distinct the voices became. One voice stood out, a deep, rasping voice that seemed to speak directly to him. "Don't look back. Stay quiet. It's watching." His heart pounded in his chest. He turned his head slowly, scanning the darkened corners of the train. But there was nothing there, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the whispering continued, desperate to ignore it. Derek tried to focus on something else, but the whispers were relentless. "It's coming closer. The train will stop soon. It's time." Suddenly, the train jolted, the lights flickered, and the entire carriage plunged into darkness. Derek's pulse raced as the train came to a sudden, screeching halt. The doors flew open, and the whispers turned into frantic, desperate screams. In the distance, through the darkness, Derek saw a figure standing near the platform, watching the train. The figure was tall and cloaked in shadow, its face hidden from view. As Derek stared, he felt a cold, suffocating presence in the air. He was being pulled, like a magnet, toward that figure. The train doors slammed shut with a deafening thud, and the train lurched forward again, this time much faster than before. The whispering had stopped, but the sense of dread remained. Derek's hands trembled as he glanced out of the window. He had passed the same platform again, but there was no sign of the figure anymore. When he finally reached his destination, he hurried off the train, shaken to his core. The platform was completely empty. As he left the station, he heard one final whisper in his ear. "You're not alone." Derek never took a late-night train again. But that whisper, it still haunted him, lingering in the back of his mind whenever he traveled. 5. The Phantom Conductor. For years, rumors had circulated about an old, forgotten line of trains that ran through the mountains. The line, abandoned for decades, was said to be a ghost train, one that only appeared to those who were either lost or searching for something they shouldn't find. Jason, a young and adventurous soul, decided to investigate the legend. He had always been fascinated by ghost stories, especially those involving trains. One night, armed with nothing but his curiosity, he boarded the last train from his hometown, hoping to get a glimpse of the mysterious route. As soon as the train left the station, Jason felt the shift in the atmosphere. The air seemed thinner, colder. The train creaked and groaned as it climbed up the mountain, the moonlight barely filtering through the mist that surrounded them. There were only a handful of passengers, all of whom appeared to be lost in their own thoughts, staring blankly at nothing. Jason, eager to learn more, approached the conductor at the front of the train. The conductor was a tall man, dressed in a vintage uniform that looked like it had been pulled from another era. His face was pale, his eyes almost glowing in the dim light. "Where is this train going?" Jason asked, trying to hide his unease. The conductor didn't answer right away. Instead, he merely smiled, a smile that was far too wide and unsettling for Jason's comfort. "It's not about where you're going," the conductor replied, his voice eerily calm. "It's about where you've been." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. The air around him seemed to freeze, and he suddenly realized the train was moving faster than it should have been. The landscape outside the window was blurred and distorted. They were no longer in the mountains, no longer in the world Jason knew. As the train accelerated, the other passengers began to stir, their faces twisted in silent terror, their eyes hollow. It was as if they were trapped in a trance, forced to remain on the train for eternity. Jason turned back to the conductor, desperate for answers, but the conductor was gone, vanished into thin air. The train continued its relentless journey through a nightmarish world that Jason couldn't understand. The walls of the train seemed to close in, the lights flickering out one by one, plunging the train into darkness. In that darkness, Jason heard the whispers of those who had come before him, trapped in the same ghostly train for all eternity. There was no escape, only the endless ride. When Jason finally woke up, he was lying on the floor of his own apartment. The daylight streamed through the windows. He wasn't sure if it had all been a dream, or if he had truly boarded the ghost train. All he knew was that the train was still out there, waiting for those who sought it, and the conductor would never let them leave. 6. The Vanishing Track. Emma had always been a firm believer in the supernatural, but she had never experienced anything out of the ordinary, until one fateful evening when she boarded the last train out of the city. It was raining heavily, and the train station was nearly empty. Emma found an isolated seat near the back of the train, hoping to relax on the quiet ride home. As the train pulled out of the station, she noticed something strange. The tracks ahead seemed to shimmer, almost like they were fading in and out of existence. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, but as the train picked up speed, the tracks ahead grew more distorted. The world outside the window blurred, and the faintest feeling of dread settled over her. The train seemed to slow down, despite the fact that it was supposed to be speeding up. Emma looked around and saw that the other passengers were now staring at her, their eyes wide with terror. They didn't speak. They didn't move. It was as if they were frozen in place. The train's lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Emma felt her heart race. She fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. No one responded to her calls. The track ahead seemed to have completely vanished, replaced by an endless void. There was no way to know where they were going, or if they were even going anywhere at all. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the train stopped. Emma was thrown forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The doors opened, but there was nothing outside, only an impenetrable fog. She hesitated, but the other passengers started to file out, their movements robotic, their faces blank. Emma stepped off the train, and as soon as her foot touched the ground, the train vanished behind her, leaving only silence and the thick fog. It was as if the entire train had never existed. She was alone, lost in a place that didn't belong to this world, and she knew she would never forget the feeling of that train, the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare where the tracks had no end. The world of haunted trains is filled with mysteries, where reality itself can bend and break, trapping passengers in a twisted, otherworldly ride, whether they're cursed by the past, lost in time, or drawn into realms unknown. These stories remind us, not every train is a journey to the destination you expect. Sometimes, it's a ride to the unknown. 7. The train to the forgotten town. It was supposed to be a routine trip for Alicia, just another day commuting to work. She had boarded the train at her usual station, a quiet suburban stop where nothing ever seemed out of place. The train was a bit crowded, but nothing too unusual. It was the 8:30 a.m. express to the city, a ride she had taken countless times before. As the train sped toward its destination, Alicia began to nod off. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels was soothing, and soon she was drifting into a light sleep. But suddenly, the train lurched. Alicia's eyes snapped open, her heart racing. The train had come to a complete stop in the middle of nowhere, nothing but dense woods surrounding them. Confused, Alicia glanced out the window. A faint fog had rolled in, obscuring the view of the tracks ahead. The other passengers were eerily silent, and the conductor, a man in a crisp uniform, had disappeared from the front of the train. She could hear a faint whisper from the back of the carriage, but when she turned around, no one seemed to notice. Suddenly, the door to her carriage opened, and a man in old-fashioned clothing stepped inside. He had a wide-brimmed hat, a long coat, and a peculiar expression on his face. Alicia stared at him, but he didn't speak, just gestured toward the door as if inviting her to follow. Alicia hesitated, but something about the strange man's gaze seemed to pull her toward him. She rose from her seat, her body moving almost involuntarily. The air was thick with tension as she made her way toward the door. When she stepped outside onto the platform, she found herself in a small, decaying station. The sign above read Westbury, a town Alicia was certain didn't exist on any map. The station was eerily quiet, with only the faint sound of creaking wood and the occasional gust of wind. Alicia felt a strange chill in her bones as she looked around. There were no people in sight, only abandoned buildings and overgrown streets. The train had vanished, leaving her stranded in this forgotten town. As Alicia explored the town, she discovered that no one could remember how long it had been abandoned, or why. There were no answers, only a deep sense of emptiness. She tried to call for help, but her phone had no signal, and the few strangers she encountered were too strange to trust. Some looked at her with pity, while others seemed to avoid her entirely, as if she didn't belong. After what felt like hours of wandering, Alicia found her way back to the station. The train had returned, waiting for her. The conductor, now back in his uniform, smiled at her, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Ready to go?" he asked. Alicia nodded, still reeling from the bizarre experience. She boarded the train once more, but as the doors closed, she looked out the window and saw Westbury fading away, as though it was never there at all. The train resumed its journey, and Alicia never spoke of what happened that day. But every time she passed through that same stretch of track, she couldn't help but wonder if Westbury was still out there, waiting to claim someone else. 8. The haunted track. It was a story that had been passed down among the locals for generations, the story of the haunted track that ran through the forest. The track had been abandoned after a tragic accident, but the legend persisted. Some said the ghosts of the victims still wandered the area, and that the trains that ran through those woods were cursed. Alec had heard the stories, but he didn't believe in ghosts. He was a skeptic, someone who believed in logic and reason, not in things that went bump in the night. So when his job as a railroad engineer took him down that very track late one evening, he thought little of the warnings. The train he was driving was an old cargo train. Nothing special, just a routine delivery. The woods were quiet as they rumbled along, the only sound being the hum of the train's engine. But as they approached the old stretch of track, Alec noticed something strange. The lights inside the train flickered, and the temperature seemed to drop. He tried to shake it off, thinking it was just a mechanical issue or the cold of the night air. But then, in the distance, he saw it, a figure standing on the tracks. A woman, her face obscured by a long, dark veil, staring at the approaching train. Alec slammed on the brakes, but the train didn't slow down. The figure remained unmoving, her presence almost haunting. The train sped closer, but the figure didn't flinch, as though she was waiting for something. "Damn it, not now," Alec muttered, trying to pull the emergency brake. Just as the train was about to collide with the figure, it disappeared, vanished into thin air. Alec's heart raced as the train screeched to a halt, but there was no sign of the woman, nothing but the empty, mist-covered tracks. Confused and shaken, Alec tried to contact the control tower, but his radio was silent. He stepped outside the cabin, searching for any sign of the woman, but the woods were eerily silent. The air was thick with fog, and the track ahead seemed to stretch on forever. It wasn't until the following morning, when Alec made his way back, that he learned the truth. The track he had been driving on had been the site of a tragic accident many years ago. A woman had been killed there, and some said her spirit still lingered, seeking vengeance. Alec never drove that track again, and every time he passed that stretch of woods, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was still watching him, waiting for its next victim. 9. The Train of Lost Souls. David had always been fascinated by old trains, the kind of trains that looked like they belonged to a different time, with ornate carriages and polished brass fittings. So, when he heard about a vintage train running a special route for one night only, he jumped at the chance to board. The train, an antique steam locomotive, was said to run on tracks through the countryside, and David was eager to experience it. He boarded at dusk, excited for the nostalgic ride. The carriages were beautifully restored, with plush seats and large windows that looked out over the fading daylight. The train began its journey, but soon, David noticed something strange. The other passengers were oddly silent. They didn't speak, didn't move, and some of them stared blankly ahead, their eyes empty. David tried to engage in small talk with a few of them, but they simply stared at him as though he weren't there. Unease crept into his mind, but he dismissed it, thinking it was just part of the experience. The train passed through small villages and vast fields, but the night grew darker and colder as they traveled. Then, the train slowed to a crawl. David looked out the window, and the scenery had changed. The fields were gone, replaced by a desolate, barren landscape. The buildings outside the window were ruined, their structures decaying as though time had forgotten them. The train stopped in a desolate station that wasn't on the map, and the doors opened. A cold wind rushed in. One by one, the passengers began to disembark, walking off the train without a word. David stood frozen in place, unsure whether he should follow or stay. He tried to speak to the conductor, but the man had vanished. With no other option, David stepped off the train and into the empty station. The moment his foot touched the ground, the doors slammed shut, and the train vanished into thin air, leaving him stranded in a wasteland of forgotten souls. As he wandered through the decaying town, David saw the faces of the passengers, people who had boarded the train long before him, all trapped in this purgatory. They stared at him with hollow eyes, their souls lost forever. David realized too late that he had boarded the train of lost souls, a journey that only ended when you had no one left to speak to and nowhere left to go. 10. The Eternal Midnight Train. Lily had always been fascinated by trains. Growing up, she would watch them pass by her house, feeling an odd sense of longing as they disappeared into the distance. But it was on a fateful evening, while taking a late train after a long day at work, that she would experience something that would haunt her forever. The train was nearly empty when Lily boarded at the station. It was a routine ride she had taken many times before, but tonight, something felt different. The moment she sat down, she noticed that the air inside the carriage was unusually cold, the kind of chill that made her shiver despite her thick jacket. The train began its journey, and was about to relax when she realized that the clock on the wall read midnight. But it didn't change, it remained stuck, as if the passage of time had been frozen. She glanced around at the other passengers, most of whom were sitting in complete silence, staring blankly ahead. An uneasy feeling settled over Lily. She tried to shake it off, thinking it was just her imagination. But as the minutes dragged on, she noticed something else. There were no stations. The train didn't stop, didn't pick up new passengers, and when Lily looked outside, all she could see was endless darkness. Then, she saw the conductor. He was walking through the aisles, but his movements were stiff, unnatural, as if he were some kind of puppet. His eyes were hollow, and when he passed by her seat, he didn't acknowledge her at all. It was as if he didn't even see her. Lily stood up and walked toward the door, planning to get off at the next station. But when she reached the exit, she found it locked. Panic began to rise in her chest as she tried the other doors. All of them sealed shut. It felt like the train had no intention of letting her go. At that moment, the lights flickered, and the passengers, who had been eerily silent until now, began to murmur. The whispers turned into voices, soft and unintelligible, as though 1,000 conversations were happening all at once. Lily could make out a few phrases. Time doesn't move here and we've been waiting for so long. It was then that the truth hit her. She wasn't on just any train. She was on the eternal midnight train. A journey that never ends. A train stuck in a loop of endless night. The passengers weren't waiting for a station, they were waiting for release. They were trapped in this limbo, cursed to ride forever. As she tried to process what was happening, Lily felt the train accelerate, moving faster than it should have been. The dark outside the window deepened, and she could swear that the world beyond the train had disappeared entirely. There was nothing but darkness. Lily rushed to the front of the train, desperate to find the conductor and demand answers. But when she reached the front, she found that the conductor's booth was empty. There was no one in charge, no one to stop the endless journey. Then, a voice from behind her froze her in place. "Welcome to the midnight train," it said. "You'll be with us forever." Lily turned to see an older woman, her face worn and tired, standing in the aisle. "We were all like you once," she said with a sigh, "thinking we could escape. But there is no escape. This train doesn't stop. It never stops. We've all been here so long that we've forgotten what time even means. We are the lost ones now." Lily's heart raced, but there was nowhere to run. The train was moving, and there was only darkness ahead. She was part of it now, just another passenger trapped in the endless night. 11. The Phantom Engine. It had been a long day of hiking through the woods for Sam, and the last thing he wanted was to walk the remaining few miles back to his car. So, when he stumbled upon an old, seemingly abandoned railway track, he figured he could catch a train back to town instead. The tracks hadn't been used in years, or so he thought. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the landscape as Sam walked along the tracks. He could barely make out a small station in the distance, obscured by trees. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to check it out. Maybe there was a train that still ran on occasion. As he reached the station, Sam felt an unsettling sense of isolation. The building was old, its paint peeling and windows cracked. It looked like it hadn't been in use for decades. But then, as if by some miracle, Sam heard the faint sound of an engine in the distance. A train was coming. Excited by the prospect of catching a ride, Sam stepped onto the platform, waiting for the train to arrive. The sound of the engine grew louder and louder until, finally, the train appeared around the bend. But it wasn't a normal train. The engine was blackened with soot, its wheels grinding harshly against the tracks, and the air around it was thick with an eerie, unnatural fog. Sam stood frozen as the train pulled to a stop in front of him. The door to the first carriage creaked open, and a tall figure stepped out, a conductor dressed in old-fashioned attire, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Are you getting on?" the conductor asked in a voice that sent a chill down Sam's spine. His eyes glowed faintly from beneath the shadow of his hat. Sam hesitated. There was something wrong with the train. It didn't look like any modern locomotive. The smell of burnt coal filled the air, and the whole train seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. But the conductor's stare was compelling, almost hypnotic. "It's the last train of the night. You won't want to miss it." Despite his instincts screaming at him to run, Sam found himself stepping aboard. The doors closed behind him, and the train began to move, pulling away from the station with a deafening roar. Sam could hear the low, guttural sound of the engine as it barreled through the night, the train moving faster and faster, as if it was racing against time itself. The passengers aboard the train didn't speak. They didn't even move. They were all seated in their own private worlds, staring blankly ahead with hollow eyes. Sam felt a growing sense of dread as he realized that no one on board was alive, not in the way he understood it. He looked out the window, hoping to see something familiar, but all he could see were endless, twisting tracks leading into a dark void. The landscape was no longer recognizably real. It was as if the train was traveling through a different realm entirely. Finally, he turned to the conductor, who was standing silently at the front of the carriage, watching Sam intently. "Where are we going?" Sam asked, his voice shaking. The conductor's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "We are going nowhere, my friend. This train doesn't have a destination. It's taking you to a place where those who board never leave." Before Sam could respond, the train screeched to a halt. The lights flickered, then went out completely. The carriage was plunged into darkness. Sam's heart raced as the last vestiges of sanity slipped away. He was trapped. There was no escape. The train, and all of its ghostly passengers, had been taking him to a place where the tracks never ended, where the journey was eternal. 12. The Silent Ride. Thomas was no stranger to overnight trains. A business trip took him from one city to the next, and the 11 p.m. train was his preferred route. He loved the peace and quiet of late-night travel, the gentle rocking of the train that helped him drift off into a deep sleep. But on this particular night, something was off. The train was quiet, too quiet. There were no conversations, no phone calls, no sound of laughter or the shuffle of footsteps. It felt as though everyone aboard had disappeared, leaving Thomas as the only living soul on the train. The conductor didn't come by to check tickets. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the empty seats. Thomas started to feel uneasy, but tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that was creeping up on him. 13. The Train to Nowhere. Emma had always been a night owl, and on one quiet evening, she found herself waiting at an old, almost forgotten train station. She had been driving for hours, looking for a place to rest before continuing her journey, but all the motels along the highway had been closed. Tired and frustrated, Emma decided to wait for the next train that would take her to the next town over. The station was empty except for a few benches, and a soft mist began to roll in from the tracks, making the place feel more like a scene from a dream. As she sat waiting, Emma noticed a single, dim light shining from down the tracks. It was far off, but the eerie glow seemed to beckon her toward it. She checked her watch. It was nearly midnight. It was strange. She hadn't seen any signs of the train she was supposed to catch, yet there it was, appearing seemingly from nowhere. When the train finally rolled into the station, it was old and worn, covered in layers of rust. The engine emitted a strange low whistle that sent shivers down Emma's spine. The doors opened with an unnatural squeal, and a conductor in a black uniform stepped out, his face partially obscured by shadows. "Are you getting on?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. Emma hesitated for a moment, but the cold air and the empty station around her made the idea of getting on the train seem oddly comforting. She nodded and stepped aboard, passing the conductor with only a quick glance. The interior of the train was just as odd as the outside. It was decorated with worn velvet seats and dimly lit chandeliers, the kind of design that seemed frozen in time. The train car was empty except for a few passengers who were sitting in complete silence, staring vacantly ahead. Emma felt a twinge of unease, but she attributed it to her exhaustion. The train began to move, slowly at first, and Emma tried to relax in her seat. But as she gazed out the window, she noticed something strange. The landscape outside wasn't changing. The tracks seemed to stretch on forever, with no sign of any town, any building, or even any natural landmarks. It was as though the train was moving through an endless void. She turned to the other passengers, wondering if anyone else had noticed, but they were all just as silent as before, their faces blank and unblinking. Minutes turned into hours, but the scenery remained the same, stretched out and barren, with only the occasional flicker of a distant, dim light. Then, the conductor appeared again, standing at the front of the carriage, staring straight at Emma. "Don't worry," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "You're not lost. You're just passing through." "Passing through where?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "Where is this train going?" The conductor simply smiled, but it was a cold, unsettling smile. "It's not about the destination. It's about the journey. Some people get on, and they never leave." Emma's heart skipped a beat. The realization hit her like a wave. She was trapped. There was no destination, no end to the tracks. She was on the train to nowhere, a place where the lost and forgotten were taken to wander, never to find their way back. As the train continued its endless journey through the empty darkness, Emma couldn't help but wonder how many others had boarded this train, never knowing that it would be the last ride they would ever take. 14. The Last Passenger. It was late into the evening when William, a seasoned traveler, boarded the final train of the night. He had been on many trains throughout his life, from high-speed bullet trains to ancient locomotives. But this one felt different. The station was nearly empty, the lights dimming in the corners as if it were preparing to close for the night. There were only a handful of passengers on the platform, and even fewer in the train car. William took his seat and looked around. The carriage was quiet, with no one speaking, no one even acknowledging each other's presence. The air felt dense, as though time itself was suspended. The only sounds were the steady hum of the train's engine and the faint creaking of the rails beneath them. The train began to move, and William tried to settle in for the ride. But as the train picked up speed, something strange began to happen. The lights flickered, then went out altogether. The train car was plunged into darkness. William's pulse quickened as he tried to adjust his eyes to the blackness. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the car. It was odd, the other passengers didn't seem to notice or react. But William could clearly hear someone moving closer. He stood up, his breath caught in his throat, and strained his eyes to see who was walking through the dark. Then, in the distance, he saw it, just a faint outline at first, a shadow, moving swiftly down the aisle toward him. As it drew closer, he could make out a figure, a man dressed in a tattered suit, his face obscured by shadows, walking with an unnatural gait. "Who are you?" William asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man didn't respond, only continued to approach. When the man finally reached William's seat, he stood there, silent, his face hidden in the darkness. But then, to William's horror, the figure began to speak, his voice deep and hollow. "This is the last train. You're the last passenger." Before William could react, the train jerked to an abrupt stop. The lights flickered back on, and the man vanished, disappearing into thin air. But the scene had changed. The train station outside the window was no longer the familiar one they had departed from. The world outside was strange and unfamiliar, no lights, no people, just a desolate, fog-covered wasteland. It was as though the world had been erased, and they were now drifting through an empty void. The conductor appeared then, standing at the front of the car with a solemn expression. "You're not getting off this train," the conductor said in a voice that chilled William to the core. "The ride is over, but the journey continues, forever." William realized with a growing sense of dread that he wasn't the first to be caught in this strange, unending ride. The train wasn't going anywhere. There was no final destination. It was a train for the lost, those who had nowhere else to go, trapped on an endless loop of travel. As the train began moving again, William sat back in his seat, staring out the window at the dark, empty world that now surrounded them. The train carried him away from everything he had known, but no matter how far they traveled, there would always be one passenger left, one last soul who never truly arrives. And now, it was his turn. 15. The Train of Forgotten Memories. Sarah had always been fond of the old railway station on the outskirts of her town. It was a place that had once been bustling with activity, but over time, it had fallen into disuse, replaced by modern transportation systems. The trains no longer stopped there, and the station was gradually forgotten. One evening, while walking through the abandoned station, Sarah noticed something strange. A train was parked on the tracks, an old steam engine, with smoke billowing from its chimney. The sight sent a shiver down her spine, but curiosity got the best of her. She approached the train, and as she did, the door to one of the carriages creaked open. Without thinking, Sarah stepped aboard. The interior was magnificent. Polished wood floors, golden chandeliers, and plush velvet seats filled the carriages. It was as if time had stopped for this train, and Sarah had been pulled back to an era long gone. The passengers, dressed in clothes from another time, sat in their seats, talking in hushed voices, all oblivious to her presence. 16. The Midnight Shift. It was a cold night when Joe, a late-night engineer, was assigned to work the graveyard shift on the old freight train. The job was simple enough: monitor the tracks and ensure the trains ran smoothly through the night. He'd done this hundreds of times before, and the routine had always been the same. But tonight, something felt different. As he boarded the engine and took his seat in the control room, the lights flickered overhead, but he thought nothing of it. The train began to move, its wheels clacking rhythmically against the rails. He checked the time, 12 a.m. Everything seemed fine. But as they moved further into the night, things began to get strange. At first, it was subtle. a low hum in the distance. Faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The lights inside the engine flickered again, and the temperature in the cabin dropped. Joe rubbed his hands together, trying to keep warm, but his breath began to mist in the cold air. Then, the radio crackled to life. Static filled the air, followed by a voice, a distorted, garbled voice that sounded almost familiar, but not quite. The voice was calling for help, pleading with Joe to stop the train. He turned the dial, trying to get a clearer signal, but the voice only became more frantic. Joe's heart began to race as he tried to make sense of the situation. Who could be calling for help at this hour? There should have been no one else on the train. He looked out the window and noticed something that made his blood run cold. The tracks ahead were empty. There were no other trains in sight, no signs of life, just endless stretches of darkened rails. Suddenly, the voice on the radio grew louder, almost as if it was right behind him. "Stop the train," the voice shouted, now clear and desperate. "You don't know what you've done. The passengers, they're not what they seem." Before Joe could react, the train jolted forward, speeding up uncontrollably. He slammed his hands down on the emergency brakes, but nothing happened. The controls were dead, and the train continued to barrel down the tracks at an alarming speed. His mind raced. Was it a mechanical failure? Or something far worse? His eyes scanned the horizon, but all he could see was the same endless stretch of tracks, stretching into an abyss. Then, through the fog and shadows, he saw them, figures standing by the tracks. They were vague at first, just silhouettes, but as the train drew closer, their features became clearer. They were passengers, tall, gaunt figures with empty eyes, wearing tattered clothing. They weren't moving. They just stood there, watching the train, waiting for it to pass. As the train got closer, Joe saw that they were not alone. There were more of them, hundreds, stretching out into the distance, standing still, waiting, their hollow, lifeless eyes fixed on him, as if they had been waiting for someone to come and set them free. Joe's breath caught in his throat as the realization struck him. These were the souls of passengers who had boarded the train, never to leave. They were trapped in a timeless loop, cursed to wander the tracks, waiting for a conductor who would never come. The train sped on, faster and faster. As the figures began to fade into the fog, Joe tried again to stop it, but the train was beyond his control now. It had taken on a life of its own, and the more he fought, the more it sped ahead, dragging him into the darkness. The voice on the radio spoke one final time before it went silent. "You'll join us soon, engineer. This is your new home." Joe's eyes widened in horror as the engine surged forward, and he realized, too late, that he had become a part of the curse. The midnight shift had claimed him. Just like all those before him, he was now another ghost trapped on the endless tracks, riding the midnight train, never to escape. 17. The Phantom Express. Riley had always been a train enthusiast. Ever since childhood, he had admired the power and grace of locomotives as they tore down the tracks. It was no surprise that he grew up to work as a conductor for one of the oldest rail lines in the country. Most of his job was mundane, checking tickets, making sure everything ran on schedule, and keeping the peace among passengers. But one fateful night, Riley's shift took him to a train he had never heard of before, the Phantom Express. It was nearing the end of his shift when the dispatcher called him into the office. He was assigned to a late-night run, an extra route that wasn't usually on the schedule. The train he would be riding on wasn't marked on any of the papers. The Phantom Express was simply written on a slip of paper, with no further explanation. Curious but intrigued, Riley made his way to the platform, where he found the train waiting for him. It was an imposing sight, an old-fashioned locomotive with black smoke billowing from its stack. The carriages were rusty, with faded gold lettering along the side. It seemed like something out of another era entirely. The train was empty, no passengers, no crew members. Riley stepped aboard, his footsteps echoing on the old wooden floors. He took his seat in the conductor's cabin, and the doors slammed shut behind him, sealing him inside. As the train began to move, Riley noticed something strange. The wheels made a soft hissing noise as they turned, almost as if they were moving through air rather than on tracks. Looking out the window, he saw the world around him was completely different. The scenery outside was dark, the landscape distorted and blurred, as if reality itself was bending. The train rattled on through the strange, shifting world, its speed increasing, But the faster it went, the more eerie the ride became. The lights flickered, the temperature dropped, and a faint sound of distant whispers filled the cabin. The train continued on, and soon Riley saw something in the distance, shadows moving along the tracks. He looked closer, and his stomach churned. The figures were human-like but distorted, their faces pale and their bodies thin, like spectral passengers walking beside the train. Then, Riley heard it, the sound of someone knocking on the door. He turned to see a figure standing at the entrance of the conductor's cabin, a man dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his eyes hollow and glassy. "Let us in," the man said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Riley shook his head, instinctively backing away. "Who are you?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he reached for the door handle. Riley rushed to stop him, but before he could reach it, the door opened on its own. The figure stepped inside, followed by more, dozens of them, all wearing the same blank expressions, all staring directly at him. They took their seats, settling into the empty chairs as though they had been there for years. None of them spoke. They only watched him with those cold, unblinking eyes. "Why are you here?" Riley asked, his voice trembling. One of the figures, an elderly woman with silver hair, spoke softly. "This is the Phantom Express. It's not a train for the living." Before Riley could ask what she meant, the world outside the window shifted again, the train speeding through a landscape of shadowed ruins, where the sky was pitch black and the air was thick with an oppressive fog. The whispers around him grew louder, a cacophony of voices crying out in despair, pleading for release. Riley realized that the train was not just a vessel, it was a prison, carrying the lost souls of those who had died on the tracks, never finding their final destination. The train sped on, faster and faster, as the passengers sat in silence, waiting for their journey to end. But for Riley, there would be no end. He was trapped aboard the Phantom Express, bound for a fate worse than death. And as the train hurtled into the dark unknown, Riley understood the truth. Some trains didn't go anywhere. They simply carried the lost souls forever, doomed to travel through the shadows for eternity.